Folks, thanks for coming. It's 9:01 and I want to be respectful of your time. You should be able to see a live transcription at the bottom of your screen. We are recording this, so if you know somebody who's unable to make it today, please let them know. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat, and I'm going to leave some time at the end to answer those questions, hopefully, with respect to being able to answer your question. Mike Blakely is not able to make it today. He's a little under the weather, so I'm going to be the only speaker today. But again, thank you for your time. Let's get right into it. What we normally do in these webinars, if you've never come before, is give you kind of a quick macro overview. And then we look at the Marin County economy with some comparisons to the state. So this graph shows you two things. It shows you the evolution of the American job market in the Great Recession to give a context and comparison to what's happened so far as we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and inch our way toward full recovery, which is that red dotted line. So in the Great Recession, that number 100 is the number of jobs indexed, because the size of the economies were different, to November 2007. And it took about 78 months for us to get back. That long bull period where the blue line lived below the red dotted line is why we called that the Great Recession. This is the COVID-19 progress, or the recovery from COVID-19 and its progress in the job market to April 2022. The new data for May will come out in a couple of weeks. 99.5% back. So when you hear about jobs recovery, this graph really shows you this sort of slow, steady movement back toward where we were pre-pandemic, using January 2020 as a pre-pandemic benchmark. But the key is we got to get that black line over the red line. And we're going to see in a minute that there's some confounding things happening in our economy that mean that job progress is one thing, but we know that there's some other issues. And the first big issue is inflation. So what these data are is what we call core personal consumption expenditures prices. And what that is you take the shopping cart that the typical household buys every month, and you strip out food and energy prices, which I'll come back and talk about in just a second. And this is what the Federal Reserve looks at when it thinks about are interest rate increases actually affecting household prices that we face. And that blue solid line shows you the evolution of this specific way of thinking about inflation. And so it's the percentage change looking back 1 year from 2007 on a monthly basis looking forward. So that MAR 5.2% is March 2022 looking back to March 2021. And it was 5.2% more to purchase that same shopping cart after you take out food and energy expenditures. And you can see that we've been on this real vertical climb since basically about 1 year ago. So April 2021. The evolution of prices from here is supposed to follow these red dots. That's basically the latest consensus forecast in terms of where inflation is going. You'll notice also at the very top of that blue solid line, you can see there's a little bit of a hook moving back down again. So the current interest rate environment with respect to the Federal Reserve increasing interest rates the last couple of times they've met suggests that maybe they are having some effect on this price index. And again, this is what the Federal Reserve is watching. They want that blue solid line to be closer to the dotted line, which is at 2%. And you can see the evolution of those red dots are slowly declining toward it, but notice it's over the next few years, not the next few quarters or months. So it's going to take some time to, in a sense, devolve from the current inflation problems. But the trick is that all that sort of macroeconomic policy gobbledygook boils down to, what do we really got to watch if I'm just some random person picked out in terms of trying to just get by? We got to see that prices are falling or stabilizing at the grocery store, at the gas pump. So we should expect that gas prices by September are going to start inching up on $7 a gallon generally across our region, unless something comes to a close in Eastern Europe and we find other supply sources. But at this point right now, we're expecting that prices are not going to necessarily fall by $1.50 over the next few months. They're probably going to creep up by 20 or 30 more cents, especially in our region. We should expect that to happen. However, it's in the fall where we're really expecting to see some acceleration of that downturn, but we've got to see that. How high will interest rates ultimately go to try to curb this issue in inflation? That's the big question in financial markets. And if you've seen, and you've been watching your portfolio, if you have one, it's been a pretty tough few months. And a lot of that's because financial markets know that the Federal Reserve is going to be increasing interest rates to slowly turn the corner on inflation. That turn of the corner comes with a cost, and some of it's going to be financial wealth gained over the last couple of years. Wages have been rising, partly because workers are facing these higher costs, including food and energy prices, and so they're going to want higher wages. We also have had people who've left the labor force either by moving away or by choice, which has shrunk the supply of workers that are available and thus put upward pressure on wages. How much higher can wages go that it stops providing an incentive for employers to hire and thus slows down that labor market recovery we saw before? Those are big questions economists are thinking about. And then maybe one of the biggest things we're going to see over the next few months is where are housing prices going? So we've seen some amazing housing price growth regionally here around Marin County over the last couple of years. Will that continue to be, let's say, single digit, double digit growth? Will it start to move towards zero? Will we actually see some price declines? And how is that driving these inflation data? So one thing to think about is that inflation data, if you're thinking about that shopping cart, housing, whether it's rental or you're purchasing, is a large portion of our monthly spend at home. So that when housing prices go up with that kind of speed, it pushes inflation up a little faster than it normally would be. At the same time, we've had supply side issues with respect to global supply chains and also finding workers and just finding goods and services generally as we're slowly still reopening our economy toward more of a pre-pandemic norm. But we're going to watch housing very closely because that's going to turn into community concerns over, are we building enough? Are we building the right mix of housing? And what's that mean for economic and workforce development over the next few years? These data just came out a couple of weeks ago from the Philadelphia Federal Reserve, and every quarter, the Philadelphia Federal Reserve interviews 40 economists and says, hey, what do you think is going to happen over the next few quarters and the next few years with specific macro data? So these are the three big ones I pull out every time this quarterly forecast comes out. And you can think about this as similar to a blue chip consensus forecast. The big three are real GDP growth. You think of income after inflation, which is the first two data sets. The second two in the middle are unemployment rates. And then the final one is core PCE inflation, which we just saw, or core personal consumption expenditures prices. Now, if we look at what's happened or what is believed to happen over the next few quarters, you can see that here. Notice that the shaded area that starts at 2.3 in quarter 2, 2022, and you look to its left, it was 4.2% growth predicted for this quarter last quarter. So just 3 months ago, we had much more robust growth data for the next few quarters. You can see as a downgrade across the board. And in fact, this morning, we just got another revision of the first quarter of 2022's estimated GDP growth, meaning income after inflation, and it went down by another 0.1% to negative 1.5. So we actually saw a decline in income after inflation, primarily because inflation remained higher than we expected. But there's also some issues in terms of what happened with Omicron and how that slowed down consumption in certain business investment. And also we saw a decline in fiscal spending, all of that sort of contributing to a slower growth rate in the first quarter. Now, you can see here that while there's been a downgrade, there's nothing negative over the next few quarters, and we'll come back and talk about that in a second. Unemployment rate, like we saw before, the labor market looks like it's going to continue to kind of burgeon forward, which is good. No real change there. And then inflation is elevated. Again, the shaded area 4.3 at the very top. If you look to its left, starting at 3.1, there's an upgrade of inflation over the next few quarters across the board. So forecasters are now recognizing that the inflation rate remaining relatively elevated and some of the geopolitical concerns, both sort of domestically and foreign, are maybe starting to change the direction of the economy to a slower growth pattern. Now, over the next few years, we're kind of in a pre-pandemic growth pattern where there is not a recession currently predicted in such a way that it would last more than 1 year. But within those annual data, there may be a short recession. Forecasters are still hedging their bets a little bit. We'll talk about that more in just a second. The inflation data we saw before with those red dots are shown here, just repeated. So we've had a downgrade in terms of where the direction of the economy and growth is going. We've had an upgrade with inflation, but labor markets look like they're going to remain relatively stable, with one little caveat is that we might see a little bit of a pickup in the unemployment rate with the supposition that higher wages will draw workers back into the labor force where right now they may still be missing. But the forecast here is still pretty good. It's not super like it was, let's say, 3 or 6 months ago, but we have to recognize that as inflation continues to linger around, the fixing of that is going to naturally provide incentives for slower growth. So I've been getting a lot of questions lately about, are we on the precipice of another recession? If the no case for economists is that certain things will basically happen over the next 6 months, which will keep us from slipping growth down below zero. Interest rates will remain relatively low, even though they're going to climb, and we're going to have some fiscal packages that will come out to still support growth. So while monetary policy is becoming a little bit more hawkish in terms of fighting inflation, fiscal spending, both at the state and at the federal level, will still provide some stimulus for growth. And certainly in California, we're going to have a little bit of a burst once the budget is done and that some of that surplus is spent. But we should not expect that to be a long-term thing, short of investments in infrastructure, which we're going to see how the final budget plays. We'll have some end of the European crisis in terms of hopefully some resolution there that leaves Europe in a better place by the end of the year, and global adjustments will be finalized with respect to COVID-19. So that's the no case. It doesn't mean that's going to happen. It means if those things kind of happen in concert, we can expect there's probably not going to be a recession, or if there is one, it's going to be very, very small. The yes case is a little bit more, maybe you might be thinking is a little more likely to happen. Interest rate increases will start to slow growth in such a way that we're going to creep towards zero naturally because of that inflation fighting. We're not going to have as much fiscal investment at the state or federal level in infrastructure. We're going to have maybe some of that at the state level, but we're going to shift federal spending more toward defense and things that are more internationally seeking to help rather than domestically. Inflation will remain relatively elevated, and interest rates will have some pressure on them to change. There's a lot of debate amongst economists right now that the current inflation will change expectations, which will change bond markets, which will change interest rates to a structurally higher level than we've seen pre-pandemic and maybe right after the Great Recession. And we will not end the European issues easily. They may linger on, and what that can do is it will start to then put some foundational cracks in global debt markets, as countries that rely on things that come from Eastern Europe will not have them, and they'll have to pay more for the goods they're seeking and have to take on more debt, which will creep them closer to things like sovereign default. So those ideas are starting to creep into economists' minds, but that's the yes case. If those things happen in concert, we're more likely to creep closer to a recession, and that might even be somewhat more global recession. Okay, so that's the macro context. We've been tracking the Marin County economy on a monthly basis more closely after the pandemic began. And so what this graph here is the evolution of the California total level of employment and the folks that live in Marin County and how much they've been employed in terms of the pre-pandemic, again, January 2020 level of employment. So you can see that Marin County, the blue line, fell quickly and has been creeping up, but has actually slowed down a little bit. The EDD numbers that we use had a big revision earlier this year and actually downgraded a lot of the original growth that we saw in Marin County. And how much of that is a labor force shift is somewhat unknown, but that's most likely what's explaining some of this is that the original estimates about the number of people that live in Marin County that actually have a job was overestimated before the revision, and now the new estimates have changed that, and you're going to see those data in just a second. Now that's compared to California, which is 98.8% back as of the end of April, to that red dotted line is where we basically started as a pre-pandemic benchmark. So the California economy is recovering slightly slower than the national. A lot of that's because of what's happened in Los Angeles County, which is moving slightly slower than the state on average. But Marin County has slipped a little bit in terms of the data if you look at who lives in Marin County. Now, what are the two tricks with these data? The first one is it doesn't count the self-employed, and it doesn't take into account wealth. So people have maybe have removed themselves from the labor force because Marin County is a more wealthy place and have fallen back on some of the wealth gains, whether it be housing markets or financial markets generally. And that's helped people stay away from the labor force for the time being, or start a business that is not counted in what the EDD reports. And I'm sorry in that title, it should have said 98.8. This is a look at the progression for Marin County employers. So the last graph was who lives in Marin County. This is who works in Marin County, regardless of where you live. So two big items. One is that non-farm employment is 8.3% below January 2020 levels. So Marin County employers, and if you're an employer in Marin County, you probably know this, have been struggling to get folks back into work, and also just finding workers generally across our region who want to commute in and or just simply want to work at the current wage level. So this has been sort of the classic friction of coming out of recession, but this recession has been a little bit different because generally employers are more in command of labor markets and driving workers back to work. Workers have had a little bit more power coming out of this recession, somewhat because fiscal spending provided some relief in the beginning and allowed workers to look around and be a little bit more selective in what jobs they might have taken otherwise without an income coming in easy. A lot of economists are watching how much we gave additional unemployment insurance and fiscal stimulus that actually provided some length of or some amount of time at which workers could wait to take job offers. If you look toward the far right-hand side, what we're watching at Marin Economic Forum are these three industries specifically, and those are leisure and hospitality, down 22% according to EDD. Now, that could be a mix of a lot of hiring that took place right before the pandemic, and then you have hotels, motels, bars, restaurants, event centers sort of reconfiguring themselves and not hiring back at the speed you'd expect. But some of that could also be we've lost some businesses and that we maybe are not necessarily going to easily get back to that red dotted line anytime soon, which is, again, the pre-pandemic benchmark. We want to get all these numbers positive. Other services, which is a mix of hair salons, nail salons, dry cleaners, auto shops, a bunch of different personal services, down almost 12%. And government is still down 7%. Some of that's in education. Some of that's in county and city government. But we have to expect that some of that is retirement, and whether or not the public sector hires back at the pre-pandemic level of total employment is one of the big questions going forward, specifically in the efficiency of our state, county, and city governments. Okay, here's some comparison data about labor force and thinking about the innards of the data we've seen already. So notice that the unemployment rate, the latest data from EDD suggests the unemployment rate in Marin County is 2.2%, which is among the lowest in the United States, much less in California. But if you walk up two rows and you see where it says civilian labor force, it says negative 7.1, almost 10,000 people in Marin County that lived in Marin County and were either looking for work or had a job in January 2020 are just not there anymore by April 2022. And the number of people that lived in Marin County and had a job is almost down 10,000 people. So what's that mean? It's a combination, again, of two things primarily. One is people have chosen to walk away, maybe for an amalgam of reasons: childcare, dependent care, the ability to reassess what you're going to do because of wealth, a bunch of different reasons, starting your own business. The other piece is that people maybe have moved away. And if working families have moved away from Marin County, the challenges inside of our labor markets are going to linger for more years to come. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second. You can see California, while the numbers are obviously much larger, the percentage changes are shrinking closer to zero. And this has been creeping along every month in California on average. And California is now down to 4.6% unemployment after seasonal adjustment. So I'm sorry, these are not seasonally adjusted, but it's still relatively low and been shrinking over time. We were asked to talk about taxable sales per capita across the city. So the latest data from the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration, which used to be BOE, is now had just published the 2021 year-end data on sales taxes. So using the population data that just came out from Department of Finance, we're going to talk in a little bit more detail in just a second, and those taxable sales data, these are in descending order in 2021, the taxable sales per capita. Now notice at the very bottom, places like Ross and Belvedere are relatively low because that spending generally takes place outside those smaller cities. But we have, for Corte Madera, because there's so much retail in terms of its business mix, the numbers are much higher. You can also see between 2019 and 2020 a dip and then recovery in 2021. The rest of the county, you can see at the bottom, a lot of that driven by our unincorporated areas along the coast and or let's say between San Rafael and Novato, and then Marin County overall, the dip and then the recovery. But these data at least give you a sense of each one of those places and what's happened with respect to where we were before the pandemic. And we've all heard this story that we've had the recovery. The one thing to watch for is where the growth has happened inside our places in our county. And that is, we think about it, a lot of the surge that initially took place in 2021 was coming in what we call other retail. So internet sales that are taxed at where the final delivery of the goods are. That has now shifted more toward brick and mortar, which has been good. So there's been some recovery there, and that helps support businesses staying in business that are local businesses Well, we have to watch closely over the next couple of years how much of that is more of a coming out party from the restrictions from the pandemic, or maybe that people really want to support our brick and mortar retail businesses in the medium to long term. We're going to watch that very closely as the retail environment becomes more and more competitive, especially as the travel environment comes back. These data just came out a few weeks ago from the Department of Finance, right around the time that the governor's May revise came out in terms of the state budget. This shows you across the cities of Marin County the change over the last 2 years. So I didn't want to just show the change over the last year. I wanted to show what's happened since before the pandemic, but the trend in Marin County has been losing population over the last 4 or 5 years. So one of the things that Marin Economic Forum is very concerned about is we kind of know these data, but what data are going to tell us whether or not we're seeing a trade of working families for older residents that may not have kids or may not necessarily intend to work in Marin County for an employer in Marin County, and may either be bringing a business with them or bringing a job with them that's now portable. Those data are going to emerge, over the next couple of years. But the way to think about why that phenomenon is that if you have population shrinking, but you have the number of occupied housing units rising or basically remaining stable, the supposition is you're trading households that had more people in them for households that have fewer. So that trade has got to have some effect on labor force. It has to have some effect on our local businesses in finding workers, but it may provide a little bit more economic foundation in the county in the medium and long term in terms of bringing wealth and bringing spending power. Whether or not that spending power is shown or felt in the local economy is one of the longer term issues we're going to have to watch in Marin County toward, let's say, 2030. But folks, with that, that's what we have to present today in terms of the latest state of the state for the county and also thinking forward. Just to summarize in the next 30 seconds, the forecasts remain okay, slipping from three months ago. A lot of additional uncertainty in the global economy as well as domestically. Obviously, some of the tragedies we've seen over the last few weeks are going to maybe shape our midterm elections to a certain extent. We'll see if it has any change. But the midterm elections are going to be something that businesses and consumers are going to watch closely to think about whether or not we're going to have a different tax environment. We're going to have a different fiscal spending environment than we expected. And what's that mean for decision making over the next couple of years, inclusive of rising interest rates that don't really have anything to do with the politics, but might be watching fiscal policies with respect to how much interest rates are going to have to rise. Locally, we've seen jobs recovery. That momentum will be affected by the state, national, and global contexts. So if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to raise your hand. I didn't see anything come into the chat, and I'm sorry if you didn't see that. I thought I'd said right off the top that please put your questions in the chat if you have them. But if you want to raise your hand and have a question, we have a few minutes for me to answer your questions if you have any. So I'll give folks a little while to either raise a hand or to type something in the chat. I don't see any hands being raised quickly here. And that's okay, folks. If you don't have any questions, MEF will post this presentation and we are recording it. So if you want to provide this to anybody else or you just want to review. Randy has now asked, did you comment on where the pricing and housing is going? I did, Randy, a little bit. Thank you for asking that question. With interest rates rising, we've seen housing prices, the housing forecast slip a little bit. I talked a little bit about this when I talked about inflation, but let me be a little bit more explicit. Over the last 2 months, we've seen housing forecasts slip maybe to about 70% of where they were a couple of months ago, but still in relatively robust range, like right around 10% across all counties in California. And for California overall, but that's down from somewhere between, let's say, 12 and 15% growth just in the last couple of months. So with the threat of rising interest rates and with a lot of global and national uncertainty about where the economy is going, the supposition is that there's a bunch of vectors forming at once to slow down, if not kind of in a sense, really clip off the growth of housing prices. Buyer fatigue with relative high housing prices and sort of this constant fight over whatever existing units come into inventory, slowdown in the macroeconomy and uncertainty going forward, rising cost of credit. And the fourth one is that people are still on the move and probably have some uncertainty about where they really want to land before they make that kind of commitment. So we will see where we go, but you have to assume housing prices and their forecasts are going to slip over the next few months. Whether or not we see them slip to a negative forecast is unknown. It might kind of move towards zero and be more flat, but there's no economists out there, and we have a lot of economists saying that we don't have the same debt conditions that we had right before the Great Recession. So we're not expecting, let's say, a complete gutting of the housing market. The trade-offs are that's going to keep developers from building more, and we want those increased units. And the RHNA numbers, the regional housing needs allocation numbers, are out in final form now. So we will see how our communities look at that, with multifamily more for rent versus single family more for purchase, and the evolution of that mix. That's going to tell a lot in terms of the inventory levels. And right now, most economists are just watching inventory. Kevin asks, how much of increased consumer spending is from inflation versus an improving economy? That's a great question. So one of the things economists are concerned about is that spending now is fueling inflation, and those expectations are rising in such a way that consumers are buying now and then they intend to hold, especially larger durable purchases. So if that happens, it suggests that inflation expectations are rising structurally, and financial markets are going to want higher returns against that structural change in the way we think about inflation risk. So not only are consumers spending a little bit more because they're foreseeing inflation rising over the next couple of years more than they were, let's say, 1 year ago, that's affecting how they look at financial markets and their wealth. And they might be spending now while the getting is good. And some of that is being seen in our financial markets in terms of sell-offs and wanting to create liquidity to make those purchases while the getting is good. Randy asks, do you think the next Fed increase will increase mortgage rates again, or has already been absorbed? So mortgage rates are generally driven by the 10-year Treasury. And when the Federal Reserve increases the short rates, or the say short-term rates, there's kind of a mixed effect. And this is the subject of about 1 million pages worth of macroeconomic and monetary policy and theory research over the last 50 or 60 years. But the supposition is that the longer rates are being driven more by changing inflation expectations than what the Federal Reserve is doing. But as the Federal Reserve increases that short rate, the more aggressive they become. The 10-year Treasury may not keep up, to your point. Some of that's probably already been absorbed. And a lot of it is going to really depend on, will investors look at, well, I'm in 10-year Treasuries now and they're paying 4%. The Federal Reserve has increased rates by, let's say, a percentage and a half over the last 6-7 months. I'm going to move long-term money now to short-term. And we're going to have a lot of inbound capital coming from other countries seeking those higher rates of interest, beating down that yield the more and more the 10-year Treasury rises. So some of that, I think, has already been absorbed. How much of it is the subject of, like I said, tons of research, and there is no consensus on how flat or steep that relationship will remain. And of course, let me say it another way. One of the biggest concerns for economists is that when short-term rates go up, we don't want those long-term rates falling to flatten what's called the yield curve and the incentive of lenders to provide credit. That's what really starts to affect both financial and real markets as interest rates rise. It's a great question, Randy. You asked one of the biggest questions in macroeconomics. Anybody else out there? I didn't see any hands. But thank you so much for those chat questions. Really appreciate it. Great questions. Awesome. Okay, folks, well, we're coming right up on time. It's just about 9:30. With no more questions, I want to thank you for coming today. And I want to let you know that Mike sends his apologies. He was unable to make it, being under the weather, but we will reach out soon on our next edition of this. And so, make it a good day and make it a great summer as much as you can. And it's just, again, think in your mind, change is on the rise, but we want to stay, focused on reality and not get too absorbed in the emotion of what's going on in our financial markets or in our economy. And we just want to keep our prayers for the folks that have been experiencing these tragedies. Thank you so much. Take care.